Welcome everyone to today's Architecture and Integrator for Defense and Aerospace webinar. We're glad you joined us, and today's topic of discussion is putting FACE on contract, or the FACE technical standard on contract, considerations for programs. Today's topic, it promises to be a very valuable one. We have an impressively experienced panel with us here today. We have Bill Jacobs of the U.S. Army's AMRDEC, Tyler Robinson of the U.S. Naval Air Warfare Center, and Rod Dailey of NAVAIR. There we go. We've got Tyler on, and Rod is joining us on audio only today. So I'm going to ask you guys if you will each just start off, our panelists will just start off by introducing yourselves. If you'll give us a little bit of information, just your name, who you work for, your title, and your experience with FACE, and specifically any experience that you have in contracting, acquisitions, requirements, et cetera, as it relates to the FACE technical standard.
Hey, morning everyone, or afternoon, I guess, depending on where you are. So Bill Jacobs, I'm an engineer supporting the Army's Aviation and Missile Center. Primary focus for a while now has been MOSA, system architecture, digital engineering, and those kinds of things. And, you know, if you're familiar with the Army's structure and the Aviation Missile Center, it used to be called AMRDEC. So it's a science and technology organization. And right now I'm chopped out or matrixed, or, you know, pick your word, loaned out to FARA, the Future Attack Reconnaissance Aircraft Program Office inside of the Army. It's under the Future Vertical Lift Program.
Great. Thank you, Bill. Rod, you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, ma'am. Rod Dailey. I'm currently the IPTL and product lead for Harpoon Swim ER. I'm about to get loaned out to E2C PMA-209 for the Navy. In the past, I was the business manager, sitting council member for the consortium, and I also worked on FACE and host as well as FASTR for Navy as they tried to develop a walkthrough to incorporate FACE into their other programs.
Super. Thanks, Rod. And how about Tyler?
Hi, good afternoon. So Tyler Robinson. I'm at NAVAIR as well, Patuxent River. I previously served in PMA-209 as a lead engineer for the Avionics architecture team, so I had extensive experience working the FACE and host standards. And previous to that was in PMA-281, working UCS standards. So broad experience working some of the different open architectures, and throughout those times, heavily involved in the MBSE side of things as well.
Fantastic. Thank you all again for the panelists for joining us, and those of you that are attendees, thanks for joining us as well. We're looking forward to this discussion. The first question that we would like for the panelists to address is, how would you recommend someone even determine if FACE is even applicable, if the FACE technical standard is even applicable or a good fit for the contract that they're considering? And Bill, I'll pose that first question to you first.
Sure, thanks, Sam. That's a good question. You know, when you get into this environment, right, it's one of those questions you kind of wrestle with a little bit. You know, I think there's a couple of ways of looking at it, right? You know, the first is a product perspective. You know, if you're developing a software component, you know, when you look at the main reason for FACE, right, when you get at, you know, trying to get portable, interoperable software components that, you know, support some sort of, you know, commonality strategy, it makes a lot of sense. You know, and so from that perspective, you want to take a look at it and ask yourself, you know, do I expect that this component's going to be moved to other environments? Do I expect this component's going to be something that I want maybe to build a product line strategy around, right? If your answer to those questions from a product perspective is yes, then it's definitely, I think, something you need to take a closer look at. You know, and then from a system level perspective, you know, you want to be able to receive those components efficiently. You know, so when you take a look at, do I want my system to be able to be quickly updated or allow relatively efficient software integration? FACE is definitely an enabler for that. We've seen that in a number of demonstrations. So, you know, and those are the two perspectives I take a look at is, you know, do I want to move this thing around? And two, do I want the system to be able to accommodate and later on be easily adaptable for other software components?
Great. Tyler, did you have anything that you wanted to add to Bill's response?
Sure, I agree with, certainly agree with all of Bill's thoughts there. I'll just add, I think one thing that we look at specifically with regards to FACE is what domain is our system in, and is this particular product under development in? Certainly, FACE is targeted at the avionics type domain, and so that's one area. If you know, maybe if we're working on ground control stations, we might look at other open architecture standards. So in addition to looking for those desired ability to replace components, reuse components, etc., we just want to make sure, is this the right domain to apply FACE? FACE is not an all or nothing as far as our whole system has to be FACE. So just looking at each component, each development effort, does it make sense to start utilizing the FACE architecture in certain areas? So.
All right, thank you both. If everyone, I'm going to ask actually all three of you, if you have any tips based on your experience with regard to what folks should consider or include while developing requirements or writing the contract, I think that is something that people seem to be very interested in as well. And actually, Rod, if you're available to start off on that one.
Yes, ma'am. One of the things that when it comes to actually trying to incorporate FACE into your system, I kind of agree with both Bill and Tyler, where you have to understand what exactly are you trying to do. Are you trying to increase your capability? Do you have a portability, agility problem? Are you trying to reuse old software and update them, bring them up to real time? Things of those nature are some of the questions you need to ask yourself, because that helps you design your requirements and then go from there to what your section, working out your SOW or your statement of work, how you want to look at it, how you want to write it. But if you don't know those up front, what you're trying to actually do with your system, it kind of limits your ability to understand what FACE can and cannot do for you.
Thank you. And Tyler, what kinds of considerations do you think someone who's either working on the contract or working on a requirements document or a SAL should think about?
So there's certainly a lot to unpack with that question. I think one area definitely that you would want to focus on, or I'd recommend focusing on, is just what your approach to conformance is going to be. Sometimes that's something that's put off till later. How are we going to verify that the component is actually conformant to the standard? And that's one of the great things about the FACE consortium and the FACE technical standard is the very clear and I don't know if robust is the right word, but comprehensive verification and conformance approach. Just understanding the roles of verification authorities and how you would interact with them, and how those will relate to your other acceptance test processes, I think would be a real key piece when you're starting to write up that contract.
And Tyler, do you have a recommendation for where people should start if they're, only vaguely familiar with that process, with, let's say, the verification authority process?
I think certainly in general, the FACE consortium in itself is a great resource. So attending those consortium meetings gives you a great opportunity to kind of get the 101 flavor for a breadth of areas across the FACE standard. And so I'm certain there's opportunities there to get plugged in to kind of those overview sessions. Besides that, I think just, reading the documentation of the FACE technical standard, just diving in would be the other place to start.
Okay, thank you. And how about you, Bill? What are your recommendations?
Yeah, I think the point Tyler made about conformance is a big one. When you asked about where to start, like on the Army side, right, we have an organization that does the verification authority for the Army. So reaching out to the program office to find out, who those guys are, so you can talk to them and figure out, what's available, what support they provide and those kinds of things, just to get up to speed on how that works. So, but I guess back to the question, I think experience with data modeling, experience with the technical standard are two really big aspects, right? We've seen this a number of times in our demonstrations that, depending on how experienced that particular team is with FACE and being able to apply FACE on other efforts, has a big impact on how quickly they come up to speed or able to address your requirements. Another aspect is tooling. How mature are the tools? How mature are the processes? How familiar is the team who's doing the work with those tools and processes? You'll see in a solicitation all the time, right, that everything is sort of laid out, everything's good. And then you find out that the team that, has been put on this particular effort or program, maybe it's not quite as good, or maybe there's one or two. So really understanding what that team composition experience is and the tooling and processes is a big deal. I think another thing is the being aware of when the new text standard editions come out. We recently did an effort where we wanted a 3.0 requirement, and it was in that transition between 2.1 and 3. And so, we had enough time for the conformance test suite to catch up and all that, but there wasn't enough time allowed for that particular organization to get their tooling that they had internally migrated from 2.1 to 3. And so while they were trying to execute and do their modeling activities and such, they were also trying to, in parallel, update their tool and try to keep, a step behind, if you will, their tool migration. So those kinds of things you really don't think too much about when you're putting something on or you're laying requirements, but it's really something you need to think a little bit about when you do it, because you can get burned by schedule. I think another thing is behavior. We all know, right, that FACE, the technical standard, doesn't include behavior, but we found repeatedly that behavior will eat your lunch every time, right? Data models and the interfaces and data at the interfaces are all good and necessary, and it's simplified with the data modeling construct, but the behavior of what inputs result in what outputs, what the timing needs to be, what happens if you don't get this input from the output, all those kinds of things tie into the components. So when you're looking at your broader requirement set, it's not good enough just to say, I want it to be FACE or what have you. You really need to think about the behavior, and it couples in with your performance requirements. So those are all things that you probably should think a little bit about. And I guess the last thing I would say too is legacy. Right? When you have a FACE environment, do you have an approach or a set of requirements for how you want to deal with legacy components, adaptation patterns? Is it primarily a FACE environment, or you just trying to insert or inject a FACE component into a legacy environment? Kind of changes your strategy a little bit. So that's all I can think about on that.
That's great. You actually took the words right out of my mouth earlier when you said these are things that a lot of times people don't think about. Some of the specifics that you mentioned. And I think actually some of what you just said may tie a little bit into our next question. I know you just mentioned, for instance, including behaviors and considering behaviors when you're developing these contracts. And that's not necessarily covered by the FACE standard, although there's room for it there. It certainly can work within those kinds of requirements. But the next question for you guys is, does FACE really lend itself to the development of a performance-based acquisition? So a performance-based active or a PBA, basically an acquisition structured around the results to be achieved as opposed to the manner by which the work is to be performed. So Tyler, what do you think about that?
Yeah, Sonia, we hear the term capability-based acquisition or performance-based acquisition used a lot here at NAVAIR, just trying to move away from some previous approaches where we were specifying design details and actual implementation details. And open architecture standards such as FACE allow you to focus on what is the functionality that we need, and what are the interfaces that we would need to provide to enable that functionality. So we can really start to design and contract at that component level. So we don't need to understand what the secret sauce is, how they designed the internal workings of the code. We know we can integrate because we have defined functionality and defined interfaces backed up by a robust data model that will ease integration of those components. So really that's what's getting at that capability-based acquisition. We're not getting down to designing the components for our vendors.
Okay, and I'm sure some of you may have some more to say about that as specifically. Rod, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, to keep going with what Tyler just said, one of the things that I've encountered while I was trying to bring to the attention of my level ones or higher or senior management about interfacing and understanding that when you put yourself into a FACE environment, as Tyler just stated, it's not about, I don't need to know the secret sauce of every vendor that's in the room, but we're in a common environment. I just need to understand that we're able to communicate back and forth between the two systems, which leads to the fact that it's suitable for multi-level security, seeing how some people may be using AMRDEC 653 or POSIX, APIs or whatever. We still have to be able to communicate to each other without the feeling that we're actually opening ourselves up to leakage of some sort. So one of the things that I pushed forward on real hard about was the FACE allows for both message-based and data model-based systems to communicate back and forth without having the feeling that, well, in order for all that, it's going to require us to put particular questions in RFI so that we can get a feel for what the vendor may be able to allow and what they won't allow, which kind of puts a lot of vendors that are a little bit of a standoffish feeling because they're concerned that they're about to give up, as I said before, their secret sauce. And it's not necessarily that way. But I totally agree with what both Bill and Tyler said. The idea that you don't know what your environments that you're walking into puts you at a disadvantage when you're trying to write, say, an RFI so that the actual vendor understands what he's supposed to give back to you. So you can think that maybe they can actually support your outlook of what you're trying to do. So the disadvantage is if we as, say, speaking just for a Navy person, if we as a Navy aren't sure exactly what we're going to do, then the people that we're actually sending our RFIs out to will feel as though, well, if you don't know what you're going to do, then how am I supposed to understand what you're going to do? And now I'm starting to feel as though I'm going to give up something and lose out on something, if you understand what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I think I do. So I think I'm sure everybody does. Thank you, Rod. I appreciate that. And Bill, how about you? What are your thoughts on performance assessments and capability positions?
I think Rod and Tyler outlined it pretty well. I mean, I think FACE fits pretty well in that larger construct of defining the thing without getting into the details of the design and allowing that, you know, our ability on the government side for replaceability and other things, right, that we can go out and improve competitive acquisitions, right? Because now I'm not tied to a particular thing because we've defined the what the thing is, what the boundary of the thing is. So, I mean, I think it does very much. I do kind of the same line as before that it's more than just FACE though, right? FACE, I think, is a big enabler of it. But, you know, do you have a construct in place for how that component is described? Again, inclusive of behavior and performance requirements and those kinds of things, right? Well, you don't get into the design aspect, but you've specified it well enough that you get the details you need on the government side or whomever, right, to be able to make that a definable, replaceable component that supports our larger ACT strategy. And the other piece, I think, is, you know, we say the words to industry, and there have been a number of conversations with industry where we say, look, we're not interested in your IP inside the component. We just want to know what the interface is, what the behavior at the boundary is. And we all nod our heads up and down. But until we, you know, start actually acquiring and then exercising that ability to recompete, I think there's going to be a bit of hesitancy on industry side, right? Because I mean, we've all seen it, right? We want unlimited rights to all these components, and the FAR drives a lot of that. But when you're bringing in components maybe that have been used elsewhere, or it's mixed funding and those kinds of things, you really need to kind of take a look at what do you really need the data rights to, right? If it's a correlation engine, or it's something that you intend to kind of be a service, or some component that you intend to be able to replace over time. Do you need to have the data rights to what's inside, or even know really the details of inside, or do you need to know how the thing behaves, with respect to where the system interacts with the component? So anyway, and like I said, right, like if you guys are following the Army effort with the FEL architecture framework and the ACWIG, right, we've kind of put in place this structure that allows components to be described and defined, and patterns and data rights that go along with that. So the emphasis is very heavy on the interface description. What functionality does it provide? And it minimizes really the details that's deep inside the component. So I think those kinds of things all help industry know where the government's trying to go, and help kind of reassure them that, hey, we really aren't trying to squeeze all your IP out of you. We just don't want to be put into a box in the long term that we have to go back to you to replace it or to upgrade it. Maybe not so much upgrade it, but replace it, right, with another vendor if we want to. So.
Super. A lot of it sounds like it comes down to also just continuing to build some of those bridges between industry and government. And how about with regard to management and maintenance considerations? So what do you all think should be considered during acquisition planning with regard to the management of the project and the maintenance of the systems post-implementation? Bill, what are your thoughts on that?
I think the big thing there, again, it comes down to your intent for the component in the long run, right? Is it something that you intend to recompete? Is it something you intend to, you want to be able to replace without the OEM? Right, so it kind of goes back to the previous conversation. You need to kind of have a plan and an approach in place that you can use the specification that comes back, and you get enough details on it that you can actually affect the MOSA intent, if you will, for the system as you've defined it. And again, kind of ties back to the industry awareness and coordination piece. But it's one thing for us to say that we want to be able to replace components over the life cycle without the OEM, as an example. But if we never execute that, now, we're saying one thing and industry is seeing another, and that demand signal, to tell other industry performers, potentially from a competitive perspective, hey, we need to kind of keep our expertise in this area up to speed, because hey, the government's probably going to do a recompete on us in a couple of years, or what have you, right? So I think a big part of the approach is, one, you got to kind of know what you want to replace and what you want to be able to do with respect to the vendors, and then ultimately, once you've communicated that approach to everybody, you need to execute it at least a few times, because otherwise, they're going to finally hear you cry wolf enough times, and then we're going to kind of be back to where we are. So. My thoughts anyway.
Okay. And Tyler, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, completely agree with what Bill said. I'll just add, I think one thing to consider with regard to the standard is just ensuring organically within the government, you build some level of expertise and some level of tool sets that are available, kind of that environment to support the FACE technical standard. When you're contracting for FACE and you start to get deliverables in, things like the FACE data models, data architecture, and other associated models, they may be a little bit different than some of the deliverables you're used to seeing for defining interfaces of components. And so I would just say, while it's an upfront consideration, things like that, having the right tool sets in place to review those artifacts, having the right expertise in place, and just having that plan are going to really ease that burden downstream.
And Rod, I was wondering if we can start with you to talk a little bit about the value proposition in a well thought out, well documented acquisition as it relates to the FACE technical standard. What are your thoughts on the value proposition there?
Yeah, I'm still stuck on the one that I originally said for. I was basically talking about the fact that we can kill vendor lock, alleviate some of the obsolescence issues, and most importantly, the upgrades do not have to be, as with the original manufacturer, because basically what happens is if the OEM comes into the room and has put a system together for us to use or to incorporate into a system that a subsystem to incorporate into a system that we already have in place, they have a tendency to have everything locked to where you have to come back to them. But with FACE, it opens up the environment where you can always say, well, that was nice, but I would like to compete this, and I only want to compete this system, not my entire system, just this particular subsystem, which allows as time goes on, you will not be in a vendor lock. From the position that I sit in, I'm not as technical as Bill and Tyler is, so I'm looking at it from a point of view of a program manager. My biggest fear is when I walk into the room and say, hey, PM, I just discovered that a particular item that I have is going out of business. So I have to find out. I have to buy all that there is at the moment. And then we got to start basically doing a technical outlook of where we can find something that's close to it or better than it. And I don't have that in my budget. Well, with FACE, I can compete that particular system as we move along in the life cycle of the actual item. And perhaps by the time it gets to where the system that I already had, the subsystem I have in place, is kind of becoming obsolete. I've already got a replacement in place that still leaves me in the same position I was in before, or perhaps increases my capability, but I was not put in a position where I had to spend a large sum of my funding that I had not planned for. So when it comes to actually dealing with the sustainment of a system, one of the things that I do love about FACE that I actually had a conversation with not too long ago was, can you prove to me that I won't be buying the system again or upgrading the system in 3 years or less? That's a hard question to ask a vendor, but it's one of the questions that we as program managers ask ourselves all the time.
Great, that's a valuable note, Rod. Thank you. Bill, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think we need to keep the big picture in mind, right? Similar to what Rod said, and it comes down to efficiency, but we have a tendency to focus on the program at hand because that's what we are, right? We manage programs. But much of what we're doing when you talk about MOSA and open systems, right, really exists at an enterprise level. So, that broader perspective you need to take. And while we've seen, plenty of evidence that, the FACE technical standard adds value in terms of efficient integration and software development and planned and defined APIs and all those kinds of things. We've also found that it's a significant amount of work to do data modeling. It requires a significant amount of expertise to do data modeling, right? So, there may be some hesitancy up front in the programs to say, I don't know if I want to bear that cost. And, I don't care if anyone else uses this component or not, right? It's not my program's focus. But from a broader enterprise perspective, it is important. So, bearing that cost and kind of nugging down and bearing that burden up front will pay dividends in the long term. It's one of those things you gotta stick with the big picture and understand the benefits that it brings to your overall approach, and understand that maybe in the short term it's not directly benefiting you in terms of development costs, but in sustainment, which is what we keep saying all the cost is, it does matter, right? So again, the big picture in mind, understand it's going to take some upfront work, and particularly from expertise and tooling and the time to do it, right? So that's what I would say primarily, is just keep in mind that, applying this across the board is something that we need to keep in mind from a big picture perspective.
And Tyler?
I think the big thing here I keep coming back to is just integration. We've been very good at developing components that can perform specific functions as we need them to. But the question is, how well can we integrate components together, put them into systems that they weren't necessarily designed particularly for? Can we develop components without a specific end system in mind? With the very complex systems that we deal with across the DoD, integration becomes a huge factor in our long-term life cycle, not only the development, but the sustainment as well. So with something like the FACE technical standard, you have, as far as the data interfaces, you have that integration completed in the data model where you can generate the no kidding integration from one application to another, completely taking off that burden from the two developers on either end, where previously they may have had to sit down and hash out an ICD together. That integration can be handled almost entirely within the modeling approach.
Great.
To jump in on that, because that was a very key point that Tyler just said. I don't know if you caught it, but basically what he's trying to say from an abstraction outlook, and engineer gentlemen that are on this line with me definitely understand what I'm about to say next. FACE does not predefine system architecture. That is a very key point that Tyler just brought up. Because a lot of times what it comes down to is they say the outlook is that they believe that FACE is going to change the current design as it is. And that's not true. And Tyler just alluded to it. Because in the life cycle of the program, that becomes an issue as time goes on and people start adding more capabilities or reducing or changing the direction an asset is going in general. You don't want to have to say, well, we got to redesign the entire system in order to incorporate what you want to do. FACE does not do that.
Thank you. So I guess if you all could summarize, folks on the panel could summarize one piece of advice that you would give to a program tasked with a FACE-related acquisition or contract development, what would that be? Kind of, something sort of short and sweet, something for our participants today to kind of take away with them. Tyler, what would your thought be on that?
Just to get involved with the FACE consortium and to reach out to others in your organization or in other DoD organizations who have experience with the standard. And I think those groups will be able to point you in the right direction and be a great resource to you.
Super. Thank you. Rod?
I agree with Tyler. Get involved with the FACE consortium, and the more involved, the more questions that you have, the more that they will become answered, and the more you can direct FACE in the direction that you need in order to solve your problems.
Thank you. Bill?
Yeah, I would just say dig into the experience, processes and tools of your prospective contractors. Understand that data modeling takes time to do right. So plan for that, and don't forget about behavior. Again, we've seen that repeatedly come back and get us in the end. So data's good, it's necessary, but don't forget the behavior.
Super. Thank you all. Let's see, we've got a few questions coming in from the participants. One question we have is, what's been the most significant challenge to FACE acquisitions in your experience?
Well, it's Bill. So I guess what I would come back to is being able to succinctly lay out what the requirement is, right? How do you, we talked about, Todd mentioned way back when, not everything should be FACE. So deciding up front, where you want to apply it, where it makes sense, how it aligns to your strategy. I'll go back again to experience, right? Making sure that the guys on the government side solicitations, right? Experience. We always go back to the technical side and want to see the technical approach and dig in. The experience piece is really what we've seen on our side, right? It comes into play, you know, in terms of tools and processes, do they have the ability to execute in the time frame that you have? So, and the last thing I'd say is, you know, is how do you merge these things up, right? There's very few clean starts where there's no reuse. So what's your strategy for combining new base components or migrating legacy components, you know, for in the system that you want to migrate, or the patterns or the approach for having a mixed environment where you're going to have some base components and some legacy components. So reconciling those things has been a bit of a challenge for us.
Tyler and Rod, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, the one thing that I would add to that is it still comes down to the flexibility of the program and it knowing what it is trying to accomplish. I can't fix what I don't know.
Right. I think I'll just add one more thought, and I think the biggest challenge I see is just with any program, but whether it's a new start program or an existing program, I don't know if it's rare or never that I see the opportunity to actually start with a clean sheet of software code. Even on things that may be a new start program, there's likely other similar programs that we will be pulling from similar efforts in the past. And so just overcoming, I don't know if the hurdle's the word, but just understanding where the investment makes sense to go design a component to FACE, just trying to reuse or rework with an existing software baseline and kind of make it work in an effort to accelerate schedule and reduce upfront costs. So it's just overcoming that desire to save a little time and money upfront to build a system that's maybe more reusable or more sustainable down the road.
Okay, great. Yeah, you guys have I mentioned that earlier as well, that the payoff is not necessarily going to be in the early term, but in the maybe in the longer term. Another question that we have from our participants is, do any of you have metrics from FACE users that indicate modeling costs and benefits? So actual data as opposed to just a qualitative feel or you know, scenarios. And I think if you don't have any metrics or anything qualitative, then maybe you can provide anything that you do have, experiences or et cetera, that you can use to back that up.
I don't have anything that's distro A that can be shared. It would be Navy only. So sorry, Sonia, can't help you there.
That's okay. Understandable. I think that's probably the problem that we're going to come up against on this. If you guys don't have anything quantitative available, you know, can you just speak to your general experiences in terms of the benefits of from, you know, regard to FACE data modeling and the FACE technical standards approach and your programs?
Sure. I mean, you know, again, mentioned earlier, I came from the S&T side. So, you know, we've done a number of demonstrations based on the FACE technical standard. You know, maybe some of you guys are familiar with JMR, the Joint Multi-Role Tech Demonstrator, or MSAD. You know, we've done a number of things focusing almost exclusively on the FACE technical standard and creating a software component and trying to move it to different environments. And then more complicated demonstrations of, you know, developing a common component and then moving it across 3 different environments, like in our recent capstone demonstration. You know, your question about metrics, you know, it's one of those challenges, right? That what we found, particularly in our last one, was we didn't really lay out a complete enough or robust enough metrics collection plan at the beginning. And so, you know, what you get back is a lot of information that, you know, doesn't necessarily answer the question that maybe you were asking for in the first place. But anecdotally, and comments from the participating industry guys was that, you know, the FACE technical standard does make for more efficient integration. You when you're doing the data modeling, again, it's a lot of work up front. It takes a lot of specialized experience to do it right. But ultimately, once you've done that, it does support a lot of automation, tool-based analysis. So from an integration perspective, particularly subsequent integrations, we have seen, again, anecdotally, that it does make things more efficient. And I kept hitting on the behavior piece before, and that's where in almost every one of our demonstrations, the troubles that we had with integration were not around the FACE technical standard and the definition and the modeling of the data integration. It was the behavior and understanding the behavior at the interface. So again, I keep pounding that, but that is where we have seen the predominance of the issues during integration. It's not in that use of the technical standard or the ability to represent data using the data architecture that FACE defines. It's the behavior stuff. So anyway, at least in the stuff that we have done, the use of FACE has proven its value as part of a larger strategic approach to reuse and commonality and portability. It's just not something that you can rely on solely to meet your objectives.
That's a very valid point. And I would imagine also that when it comes to quantitative evidence that, some of the reason why we may not have as much of that at this point is just literally because of the maturity of FACE in terms of the full development life cycle and how many programs it's actually been really implemented in. Those of us involved in the FACE community, I think, hope that and expect that we'll have more of that kind of evidence rather than just the anecdotal evidence as time goes on. So it's a good question. Okay. Another question, is it appropriate to include performance standards that, like we were talking about performance standards earlier, is it appropriate to include performance standards and or to ask the contractors for input on those performance standards while developing the contract?
Yeah, Bill, I think so. We did that on again a couple of our S&T efforts, right? Where as part of your solicitation, you might ask them to provide their opinion on what standards may apply to your component definition, right? I mean, there's a lot of a typical component on a weapon system these days involves a lot of things, right? I mean, it could be an ARINC 653 kind of thing, just from an infrastructure or a petitioning perspective. It could be, a STANAG or an RTCA document, or right. There's a number of things that may dictate how a component behaves. We don't have the corner on all knowledge, right, for these components that are on our system. So I think reaching out to industry and, either allowing as part of an RFI or a solicitation, then to propose back or to recommend back particular performance standards that pertain to the component makes a lot of sense. My 2 cents anyway.
Yeah, my 2 cents on that would be, I would definitely want to write in what my vendor would be thinking about when it comes to performance standards. It would definitely be written into my RFI. So I totally agree with you, Bill.
Great. Next we have, so Bill, you were speaking earlier about how important the team is. While you're, that's an important consideration and something that people might not think about right away. So we have a question. How do you build a team with expertise, with base expertise, I'm assuming, or build expertise within your team, right? I guess there's 2 different ways to do it. You can build up that team or build up the expertise within the team, and kind of what are some of your experiences on the best way to be able to do that?
Well, I don't know about the best way, right? What we've seen on the work that we've done is, kind of this broader, when you think about S&T transitioning to actual programs of record, right? We always think about, technology and products transitioning, but transitioning knowledge and experience is something that we've been spending a lot of time thinking about and dealing with as well. What exactly does that mean? So, individuals that worked on JMR effort. And related to that, right, we've done a lot of work on solicitations and evaluations and all those kinds of things pertaining to acquiring components and, again, consider an S&T environment, but even system, broader mission systems. And then, over the last several years, getting that experience for that team. And then in our case, right, at least a couple of us, we transitioned from the S&T side to the program office side to kind of serve as that core to build around in terms of broader experience for some of these, more nuanced topics. When you talk about MOSA, what does it mean? How do you apply FACE to achieve goals of MOSA? What else do you need? Right, from that, the FAF, the ACWIG, all these kinds of things have sort of come around as a result of that. It takes that learning and knowledge that we've gained over this several years and try to push that into the production side on the PM side. So, and the PMs aren't alone, right? I mean, there are a number of PMs now that are adopting and applying FACE requirements and are starting to use FACE to as a requirement in their solicitations, and they're starting to get more and more experience under their belt. So I think it comes in from a variety of ways, but the bottom line is you only get experience by doing. So you either have to start putting it into your contracts and your solicitations and doing activities with it to get that experience, or, again, you're just talking about it because you read about it or something. So basically got to do something with it if you want to get that experience built up, at least on the government side.
Okay, and Tyler, Rod, do you all have anything to add on with regard to your experience personally or the experience of your teams?
Right. I'll highlight, maybe it goes back to one of the challenges just within NAVAIR. We do see a fair amount of personnel movement between program offices. It's not uncommon for engineers to only stay, as few as 2 or 3 years at a particular office. And so even building up that expertise within a program or within a team it can be difficult because of the turnover. It's an ongoing challenge or effort, I should say. So within NAVAIR, we've addressed that to some extent by having a dedicated team to work open architecture standards who can support across program offices. But other than that, I think it's just going to be an ongoing effort to continue to train our new employees and our existing employees who are not familiar with the standards. And certainly the FACE Consortium is active in that as well, as they're continuing to look at opportunities to invest in new classes and new training opportunities.
Okay.
I would say that it's a combination of things, and I'm probably just restating exactly what Bill and Tyler just said, but it's about exposure and adaptation. One of the hardest parts about FACE or anything for that, nobody likes change. So what you run into is people say, oh yeah, I've heard about it, I'm not interested in it. So if we expose you to it and you spend quality time around people that are trying to actually implement the idea and change the mindset of the group, they go forth and do the same thing as time goes on, and perhaps a mindset will shift to starting thinking in terms of think about FACE as you think about what you want to do next. But I gotta agree with Tyler, with the fact that our turnover rate in the government is so short, that even if I did have, say, 2 people that were really into it and spent time in the consortium and want to work it, they're pretty much going to be gone within 2 or 3 years. And my system may take way longer than that to get up and running. So it's about adoption and adaptation as well as being exposed.
Yeah, and I would, and that happens a lot on the government side in spades, right? But that same thing can happen on the industry side, which comes back again to trying to get your head around, what that team is going to be that's supporting your program or project, and potentially even maybe putting some caveats in the contract about making sure that, the program office is notified, when some of these key personnel may shift off, right? Because you encapsulate a lot of this knowledge in a few key people and everything goes swimmingly until they leave, and then you've got problems. So, but yeah, that problem that Rod and Tyler talk about on the government side happens on industry side as well.
Answers. Thank you. We have someone who's interested in knowing a little bit more about the FACE VA verification authority process. What is your experience with the FACE VA process in terms of the time and resources that should be allocated for that process? Anybody have any feedback on that?
I would just say on the Army side, on the demonstration side of things, on this last one, we put a couple components through the verification authority. It's just something you got to plan for in terms of duration. I don't recall right now how long it took. We kind of ran that in parallel in a way that wouldn't impact our schedule. But like I said earlier, I think it's just one of those things that, as you're doing your planning, if your intent is to proceed, you hear a lot about FACE alignment versus FACE conformance. And that tends to be a decision that we frequently make is we want to make sure that it conforms to the standard and you can pass the CTS, but we don't necessarily want to pay for the extra step of, all the verification and getting it conformed. So understanding what your intent is up front and then making sure that you lay that time in. And then need to also find out, do you need to pay for that, or is that a paid for activity by your organization? So kind of understanding those things will help you out, but I'm not sure I really answered your question. I don't recall how long it took, but it wasn't excessive. I mean, it's a set of sheets and information that the vendor provides that go along with it, and then that verification authority, some independent guys in the organization basically run the tool suite, go through, make sure everything's in place. And if it all passes with the shared data model compared, then, you're up and running. But it's something you need to think about if that's part of your approach.
Thank you, Bill. And in your experience, has the cost related to the VA process, is that normally picked up by the government or picked up by the industry partner?
In our particular case, it was picked up by the government team.
Okay.
I don't think that, like I said, that's one of those things, right? You need to make sure you confirm because, you get to the end and you find out that that's not covered, and then you go back to your vendor. That might be a problem, right? So definitely something you need to confirm and make sure that's who's paying for what.
Okay, thank you. Next question we have is, can you talk about the benefits of completing certification? Isn't it only certification that keeps the supplier on the hook for being or maintaining conformance? So I think so the benefits of completing certification, and does certification kind of keep them on the hook for maintaining conformance? How does that usually work?
Well, I'll just say from my experience, right? We've yet to go down the full path of achieving full conformance. It's been done. At least what I've seen is on the industry side, they've done it for that competitive advantage, right? Of saying that, hey, my components FACE conformant. On the government side, like I said, we've kind of gone down the road in many cases of alignment. So that's probably something we're going to need to take a look at in the long term is, if we keep going down the road of alignment, does it undercut the need or the benefit of conformance, or is conformance something maybe that the industry guys are pursuing from the perspective of, again, that competitive piece, and they can come up and say, here's my FACE conformant thing. But, if we keep asking for FACE aligned or not requiring conformance on the government side, we need to be aware that may go by the wayside, right? They'll just keep saying, hey, it's FACE aligned. which is a difficult thing to do, right? Because what exactly does it mean to be FACE aligned? That begs a whole bunch of additional questions. So I guess a roundabout way of saying, right, when you talk about FACE conformance, I think there's a great deal of value in it to preclude those kinds of ambiguities and what do we mean by FACE aligned. But to date, right, at least on the efforts I've been on, it's been mainly FACE alignment that we pursued in terms of aligning to the CTS tests.
Yeah, I agree. Now, I think to just add on to Bill, my thought was just about risk reduction for future efforts. If you go for full conformance, you're certainly potentially reducing some risk that would come with integrating that component into other FACE data architectures. FACE conformance systems, and performing that integration across data architectures and across systems. So I think if you're going for alignment, you do open yourself up to a little bit of potential risk there in just not knowing how you've deviated from the standard and what impacts that's going to have long term.
Great. Well, thank you all again. We are up against the hour, so I want to thank the panelists first and foremost for sharing your knowledge and expertise with us today. It's been great, and we've gotten some fantastic questions from the participants. Really appreciate all of you attending as well. This recording will be made available. There will be a video available within the next few days. So if you missed part of this, I did see some people perhaps needed to add in a little bit late. That will be made available to everyone. So you'll be hearing from us on that. Thank you all very much. We also do have a few more. We have another architect and integrator webinar coming up. The next one will be September 1st on safety certification, the FACE technical standard. Should be receiving something on that soon. And a Phenom by Skayl demo scheduled for August 11th. Thank you all and have a wonderful afternoon. Thanks to Bill, Tyler, and Rod.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Sonia.